speaks. I have the honor to open the second day of this lovely conference on the borderlines, poetry, philosophy, and mysticism in the age of Ibn Gabirol, on the 1000th anniversary of his birth. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, my friends, Dr. Omer Michaelis and Dr. Ariel Zinder, for planning and running this rich conference, and of course, for the invitation to take part in it. The influence of great thinkers, philosophers, or theologians on religious thought is oftentimes measured and appreciated merely by the extent to which their original thought left an imprint on the religious discourse, that is, in terminology, concepts, ideas they have shaped, developed, or conceived. However, another less popular parameter for considering one's impact is by examining her or his reception in the more daily representations of religious culture, such as rituals, liturgy, and prayers. There is no doubt that Shlomo Ibn Gabirol is one of those few whose unique philosophy had found its way into the Jewish prayer book. This is evidenced not only in poems such as the well-known example of the Piyut Keter Malchut, already mentioned yesterday, known from the Yom Kippur prayer. This is also the case with many other more minor poems from Ibn Gabirol's liturgical poetry, which have become an integral part of Jewish liturgy, part of which is still preserved and recited in various sidurim. One group of piyutim of this like is Ibn Gabirol's Reshut poems, that is, introductory poems designed to precede certain parts of the daily or weekly prayers. Among this, we find a Reshut piyutim attached to the prayer Nishmat Kol Hai, where Ibn Gabirol has embedded key elements of his unique philosophy of the soul. Through the use of synonyms in Hebrew for the human soul, Ibn Gabirol addressed several key ideas about the soul, its multiplicity, its connection to the Creator, its relationship to the physical body, and its part in worshiping God. Shehi la'el yechida hachachama, ורוצי לעבוד אותו באימה. לעולמך פני ללך ויומך, ולמה תרדפי הבל ולמה. משולעת בחייתך לאל חי, אשר נעלם כמו את נעלמה. הלא אם יוצרך טהור ונקי, דעי כי כן טהורה את ותמה. חסי ניסה שחכים על זרועו, כמו תשאי גבייה נעלמה. זמירות קדמי נפשי לצורך, אשר לא שם דמותך באדמה. קרבי ברכו תמיד לצורכם, אשר לשמו תהלל כל נשמה. Go humbly to your God, my soul. Hasten you to worship him in awe. Your day, your night, devote to your true world. To what purpose the pursuit of the purposeless? You are linked in your life force to the living God. He is hidden just as you are hid. Even as your maker is pure and clean, know that you too are perfect and pure. Mighty, the heavens he bears on his arm, just as you, a silent body, bear. Come then with song, my soul, to your rock, who did not form your likeness of the earth. My inner being, at all times bless your rock, at whose name every soul gives praise. And from this perspective, the age of Ibn Gabirol has in fact never terminated. We have today two lectures on Andalus. The first one by Professor Camilla Adang, Ibn Gabirol's Andalus, a Historical Survey. Camilla Adang is a professor here at the Islamic Studies at the Tel Aviv University. Her main fields of research are Islamic thought in North Africa and Al-Andalus, and the life and works of Ibn Hazm of Cordoba in particular. Additional research focus are social intellectual encounters between Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages and the Ottoman period. She is the author of Muslim writers on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, from Ibn Rabban to Ibn Hazm, and with Sabine Schmidtke, Muslim Perceptions and Receptions of the Bible, Text and Studies. Her recent and forthcoming publications analyze a series of texts from the Fatwa collections of Al-Mazumi and Al-Wanshirizi. Please. Ibn Gabirol's Andalus, a Historical Survey. I believe we have enough time 4 lectures, and then we have a concluding discussion after the 2 lectures.
Supposed to see the things in the margin as well. Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers of this truly interdisciplinary conference. I'm very happy to be here. My paper is going to be very different from the ones that are going to be presented today and tomorrow, as I hope to present the historical context in which Ibn Gabirol was living and working. So in the limited time at my disposal, I propose to give a brief overview of the political rather than the intellectual or religious history of Al-Andalus during the lifetime of Ibn Gabirol, taking 1021 as his date of birth and 1058 as the year in which he died, although neither of these dates is actually completely certain. In order to understand the dramatic political developments in the first half of the 11th century, which inevitably had an impact on Ibn Gabirol's life, we have to go back in time to the year 961, when the second Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba, Al-Hakam al-Mustansir, passed away, leaving a prosperous and on the whole stable country, a library of legendary proportions, soon to be purged, and one son, who was too young to assume power and therefore fell under the sway of his father's dominant minister, Muhammad ibn Abi Amir. He was to become known as Al-Mansur after a series of victories over the Christian armies in the north of the peninsula. Until the year of his own death in 1002, Al-Mansur was the de facto ruler of Al-Andalus, although he claimed to have received his mandate from Hisham al-Mu'ayyad, the young caliph who was largely confined to his palace and only made sporadic public appearances. Under Al-Mansur and his son and successor, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, Al-Andalus was a relatively strong and unified state, which managed to ward off Christian attempts to conquer, or as they saw it, reconquer, territories under Muslim rule in the north of the peninsula. When al-Muzaffar died in 1008, likely poisoned by his brother Abdurrahman, also known as Sanchuelo, the latter made the mistake of challenging the arrangement that had worked very well under his father and his brother, namely a clear separation between the largely ceremonial office of the caliph, who had to belong to the Prophet Muhammad's tribe of Quraysh on the one hand, and factual political and military leadership by the Hajib or royal chamberlain on the other. Abdurrahman Sanchuelo, who was already deeply unpopular among the people of Al-Andalus, now added insult to injury by claiming to have been appointed by the powerless Caliph Hisham as his successor. When in 1009 he was killed while returning from a military expedition against the Christians, a period of total chaos ensued. The simmering tensions between the various Muslim factions in Al-Andalus, to which I shall refer presently, now erupted into a civil war or fitna, which was to determine the future of the country for centuries to come. This situation is aptly described in the memoirs of the last king of Granada, Abdullah ibn Bulughil, and I quote in the translation of Hugh Kennedy: "When the Amirid dynasty, that is the dynasty of Al-Mansur, came to an end and the people were left without an imam, a leader, every military commander rose up in his own town and entrenched himself behind the walls of his own fortress, having first secured his own position, created his own army, and amassed his own resources. These persons vied with each other for worldly power, and each sought to subdue the other." Unquote. What is missing in this concise description is the fact that these persons that Abdullah refers to represent different ethnic factions. If we look at the makeup of the population of Al-Andalus, we find the following groups. First of all, there were the local Christians and Jews, who, with the Muslim conquest, had received the status of protected religious communities, Ahl al-Dhimma. On the whole, they kept a low profile and did not get involved in politics, though this changed after the collapse of the caliphate, when new opportunities were created for non-Muslims to attain high office at local courts. The Muslim population, on its part, was made up of 4 different groups. In Arabic, ta'ifa, plural tawa'if, which may be translated as factions or parties, and hence the title of David Wasserstein's indispensable work on the period, The Rise and Fall of the Party Kings. The parties in question were the following: the Arab Andalusi Party, the so-called Slav Party, and 2 separate groups of Berbers, those who had participated in the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century and stayed on, and Berbers of more recent arrival who had been recruited in North Africa by Caliph al-Hakam and the Hajib al-Mansur to strengthen their armies. They are often referred to as the New Berbers. Each of these 4 groups had chosen or been given the choice to settle in a different area of the Iberian Peninsula. Already before the Civil War, they had enjoyed a considerable measure of independence, but any attempt to assert this independence had been kept firmly in check by al-Mansur and al-Muzaffar. After the latter's death, the vociferous tendencies within Andalusi Muslim society emerged. Each group chose as its legitimizing figurehead an Umayyad prince who they believed would promote their interests. Thus, in 1009, the Umayyad Muhammad, who adopted the messianic throne name of Al-Mahdi after deposing the powerless Caliph Hisham, established himself in the capital of Cordoba with the enthusiastic support of its populace, which applauded his crackdown on the new Berbers. In 1009, however, the situation was reversed. That same year, basically, the situation was reversed with the rise of another ephemeral Umayyad Caliph, Sulaiman al-Musta'in. This man, who was supported by the new Berber faction in the civil war that fragmented Al-Andalus, occupied the shaky throne for a few months in 1009, was deposed by his rival Muhammad al-Mahdi, but was able to rule again from the spring of 1013 until the middle of 1016, when he was killed by a member of the Hammudid family, which claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Between 1016 and 1023, 3 members of the Hammudid dynasty managed briefly. Yeah. This always happens during my classes as well, so thank you. Yes? Yes. Between 1016 and 1023, 3 members of the Hammudid dynasty managed briefly to be recognized as legitimate caliphs, having supplanted the ineffectual Umayyads, but internecine struggles doomed their attempts to restore order and establish control over the declining capital. In 1013, a great massacre had taken place in Cordoba at the hands of the vengeful Berbers. Besides large numbers of ordinary townspeople, many scholars and writers were killed, while others fled the capital in different directions. Among the men who chose Hammudid-ruled Malaga as their new home were Samuel ibn Maghrela, the later Naguib, and Ibn Gabirol's father Yehuda, whose Arabic name was Yahya. It was in Malaga that Solomon ibn Gabirol, or Abu Ayyub Suleiman bin Yahya, was to be born in or around the year 1021. Before his assassination, Sulaiman al-Musta'in had generously rewarded his supporters. Thus the Sinhaja, one of the tribal groups belonging to the new Berber faction that was led by Zawi bin Ziri, were assigned the plain of Elvira in present-day Andalusia and its surroundings. Seeing that this ancient city was difficult to defend, the Sinhaja abandoned it and created a new capital, Granada. It was under the Zirid Berbers that Ibn Nagrela would manage to attain a position of considerable power and influence, to the dismay of a number of Muslim religious scholars, such as Ibn Hazm, who criticized the fact that a dhimmi was allowed to wield power over Muslim believers. Ibn Nahrila, Samuel's position, enabled him to extend his patronage to deserving writers and scholars, among whom we shall also encounter Ibn Gabirol. Solomon Ibn Gabirol was apparently still very young, though estimated ages vary, when the family left turbulent Malaga and headed for the city of Saragossa, Arabic Saraposta, the Caesarea Augusta of Roman times, fleeing the chaos that reigned in the center and south of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Umayyad and Hammudid dynasties vied for power, or the semblance of it, until in 1031, the Umayyad Caliph Hisham III and Mu'tad was forced to abdicate, which effectively marks the end of caliphal rule and the official start of the Ta'ifa period. Although in fact, the Ta'ifa states, which all in all numbered 30, no fewer than 30 at different times, had already started to crystallize well before that date. The former Umayyad provinces now became truly separate kingdoms. But when I say kingdoms, I should add that this is actually a conventional term. The Arabic sources don't use this, this term, or rather the rulers themselves did not call themselves kings, but in the research literature, we usually talk about the party kingdoms, the Ta'ifa kingdoms. So these new states were continuously attempting to expand their territory at the expense of their neighboring states. And this is something which you can see here in this slide with the various arrows which point in directions of neighboring states which they attempted to conquer. And the state that was most successful in doing so was the Kingdom of Seville. In order to achieve their goals, some local rulers even enlisted the assistance of Christian counts or mercenaries from the north. The internal divisions among and within the Muslim factions made Al-Andalus an easy target for the Christian Reconquista movement, and would later, in 1086, necessitate the intervention of the North African Almoravids. The competition between the newly created Ta'ifa states was not only for territorial and military dominance. The courts of Seville, Toledo, and Badajoz, for example, also vied with each other in attracting the most excellent scholars, poets, and artisans. It has long been recognized that this competition between the self-styled rules, usually called Muluk al-Tawa'if, generated an unparalleled cultural efflorescence. Some of the new states, such as Seville, Saragossa, and Cordoba, were ruled by dynasties of Arab descent, while others were established on the eastern coast of Al-Andalus by men of so-called Slav origin, who had been closely associated with Al-Mansur's Amirid family and who settled in places like Denia, the Balearic Isles, Almeria, and Valencia. Finally, there were the Ta'ifa states ruled by Berbers. The veterans among them were able to create states in Badajoz, Toledo, and Albarracin, whereas the new Berbers settled in the very south of Al-Andalus, creating small states like Carmona, Moron, and Ronda, and a very large one centered on Granada, as we have seen. Apart from this latter state, all the new Berber statelets would be successively absorbed into the powerful Kingdom of Seville. Back now to Ibn Gabirol. Although it is not clear why his father chose Saragossa rather than any other place, the main consideration may have been the relative quiet enjoyed by that remote region in the Upper March. It has also been suggested that Ibn Gabirol's father felt encouraged by the fact that the ruler at that time, Mundir II, had a Jewish advisor, whom I shall refer to below. In order to get to Saragossa, the family would have had to cross a number of the emerging states, not necessarily their capital cities, possibly the Taifa state of Cordoba, but certainly Zirid Granada and Toledo, which was by now ruled by the Berber dynasty of the Vounonids. Now, in none of these areas which they would have had to traverse was the political and military situation stable. As the crow flies, the distance between the northern outskirts of Malaga and the southern city limits of Saragossa is some 625 kilometers. But assuming that they were traveling using mules or horses, and the average distance covered by such riding animals was about 30 to 45 kilometers per day, the journey must have taken several weeks, especially since they would have had to negotiate various hilly and mountainous areas, as you can see on this slide, and would presumably not have wanted to travel on the Sabbath. All this assuming that they did not encounter any unusual adversities on their way. It would be interesting to know which route they took, who accompanied them, and where they spent their nights. We don't know any of this, as far as I know. Saragossa, where Ibn Gabirol was to spend the larger part of his rather short life, was ruled consecutively by two Arab dynasties, the Tujibids between 1010 and 1039, and subsequently the Hudids, who were in power from 1039 until 1110, when Greater Saragossa, like all the other Taifa states, was conquered by the North African Almoravids, who a mere 8 years later had themselves to surrender to King Alfonso I of Aragon. The region of Saragossa had been inhabited by Muslims as early as the 8th century and had grown in importance during the Umayyad Emirate and subsequent Caliphate because of its strategic location in the frontier region bordering on the Christian states of Castile, Navarra, Aragon, and Barcelona. In 1039, a revolt broke out, which put an end to the rule of the Tujibid dynasty and marked the beginning of a new period in the history of Saragossa, that of the Banu Hud, who up to that point had ruled in nearby Lerida. One of the victims of the revolt was Yekutiel bin Hassan, a Jewish patron of the arts and sciences who had held high office under the third Tujibid ruler Al-Mundir II. It would seem that Ibn Gabirol had been one of his proteges. In need of a new patron, he looked to Samuel ibn Nahrira in Zirid, Granada. Ibn Gabirol moved to Granada for an unspecified period of time, during which he is believed to have acted as tutor to Ibn Nahrira's son Yusuf, who was to succeed his father as advisor and confidant to the Zirid king, but whose life and that of many members of the local Jewish community was cut short by a violent mob. When relations between Ibn Gabirol and Ibn Nahrira soured, the former returned north, although it is possible that he went back to Granada a second time to make peace with his one-time benefactor who died in 1056. In that case, he would have had to make the arduous journey twice. In or around the year 1045, Ibn Gabirol left Saragossa. Whether this departure was of his own volition or because he was cast out by his more conservative co-religionists is unclear. As his new home, he apparently chose Valencia, as you can see here on the map, which was ruled by a grandson of Al-Mansur ibn Abi Amr. This is where he died in 1058, although, as I said, other later dates are given as well. Now, this is the year 1058 is not the end of the Ta'ifa period, but since it is the end of Ibn Gabirol's life, I chose to stop here. What I wanted to do here is to just place him in his historical context, present some highlights or rather low points in the history of Al-Andalus. We have been hearing yesterday from Sarah Strumza about the Golden Age. And it is true that there was a golden age if we talk about literature and intellectual developments, sciences. But if we look purely at the historical development, it was very much not a golden age. I mean, the periods of peace and quiet are actually very few and far between. And this is something that people often don't realize, in general surveys of Andalus, very general surveys of the history of Andalus, these things tend not to be mentioned. And I think it's important to remind everyone of these facts. Now, what I am curious to know, and perhaps during today and tomorrow's sessions, someone will actually address this question, is to what extent we find a reflection of these conflicts, these problems in the works of Ibn Gabirol, whether in his poetry or in his philosophical work. And I think I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for your attention. Wait a minute, one more slide. Of course, I've only been able to give a quick bird's eye view, but there's actually quite a lot of literature on the Ta'ifa period, starting with David Wasserstein's book, which I already mentioned. Several books in French by François Clément and Pierre Guichard and Verona Soravia, a book in Spanish by Maria Jesus Viguera Molins, and finally an important article by Alejandro García San Juan. And that is really the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to have enough time for discussion and Q&A later on. I will move on to the second lecture by Dr. Omer Michaelis, Nefesh and Nafs in 11th century Al-Andalus. Omer Michaelis is a senior lecturer at Tel Aviv University's Department of Jewish Philosophy and Talmud, specializing in medieval Jewish thought and philosophy in the Islamic age world. He focuses on the dynamics of production, transmission, and integration of knowledge in medieval Judaism and its intersection with parallel processes in the Islamic culture. Among his various studies, I'll mention his forthcoming book, Crisis, Discourse, and the Dynamics of Tradition in Maimonides' Urv, coming up with Magnus Press this year. Please, Omer, Nefesh and Nafs in 11th century Al-Andalus.
Shalom lechulam. Just a second, I will get my PowerPoint presentation to open and share it with you. Thank you for everyone who joined us here in person, and for those of you who could not come to be with us here, we are very happy that you joined us virtually. I wanted to talk about Neoplatonism as Rabbanism, but this will have to await another occasion. So I will talk about, just a second. Okay, hopefully it now works. I will talk about Nefesh and Nafs in 11th century Al-Andalus. I wish to talk on an internal tension in the use of one of the most prevalent terms in the writings of Andalusi Jewish authors, the concept of soul, that is, Nafs in Arabic or Nefesh in Hebrew. I will try to address not only the character of this tension, but also the reasons for its coming to be. What tension am I talking about? When we look at the way the concept of soul was fashioned by such an author as the 11th century Andalusi, Bahya ibn Pakuda, or in the works of some of the 11th and 12th centuries Andalusi poets, we encounter in varying ways and in different intensity what feels like a pull in two opposing directions that are in action at the same time, at the very same works. On the one hand, the soul is presented as originating in the higher realm of being, as longing to return to its former abode, as alien to the body to which it has fallen and to the realm of earthly matter in which it has found itself. Even though the body may trouble the soul with its needs and fancies, and even though one's instincts and desires may constantly try to seduce it, the soul, sometimes is described as made of light, always as striving the light, sometimes aided by the intellect, sometimes on its own, is called to overcome the challenge on its way to rescue and liberation. On the other hand, though to a lesser extent, one can sense another trend, a kind of frequency interference to the story just told, a noise coming from elsewhere, refusing to cease. According to this trend, the soul is neither originally pure nor good, nor subtle in comparison to coarse matter. In contrast, it seems that in itself, the soul inclines toward the earthly pole of being, and presented as a cunning seducer. In this view, the soul has a rebellious and stubborn essence that one has to tame and that has to be carefully guarded lest it will lead one to neglect one's duties. I will clarify at this stage the gist of my argument. This tension is the result of the transmission of two bodies of literature from the East to Al-Andalus, each in its own ways and by its own agents, and each manifesting a starkly different concept of soul. One is Zud literature, and the other can be termed, though this term does need some reservations, a Neoplatonically oriented literature. In order to clarify the nature of the different approaches, I will offer a very short archaeological exploration of the concept of soul, focusing on works whose eventual arrival at Al-Andalus and its significant circulation there, we need not speculate, as these were established by previous scholars. Given the centrality of the concept of soul in both Muslim ascetic literature and Arabic Neoplatonism, it was well studied and duly clarified by scholars in each of these fields. However, as far as I know, no serious attention was given to the remarkable tension that exists between the two approaches to the concept and to the fact that both were circulating significantly in Al-Andalus at the very same period. Let's begin then by looking at this concept of soul in Muslim ascetic literature, in Zud. At the core of this body of ascetic literature and the form of life of the Zud lies a logic of exchange that involves abandoning something of a low value and replacing it with something more valuable. Muslim ascetic throughout medieval times and beyond sought to relinquish their devotedness to everything perishable and to adhere instead to what is eternal, to cut the ties that bind them to this world in order to gain a place in the world to come, to draw their attention away from creation in order to focus on the Creator alone. These aims are not easily achieved, foremostly because one has a body, which unremittingly demands the fulfillment of its needs. But it is not only the body that hinders one. The body is joined by an inner force that is entirely attached to earthly life. This is the nafs, the soul, that is explicitly and steadily conceived as a negative element in one's inner life. The nafs is considered to be, and was sometimes translated as, one's lower self, and it is so much identified with subjugation to worldly life, so bound in its desire to it, that one can find in the words of such an ascetic and mystic as Abu Sa'id al-Kharaz, a native of Baghdad, a complete identification between the two. This world is the soul and its desires. Thus, when someone withdraws from what the soul desires, one withdraws from the world. Two main routes were proposed to anyone who wished to lead a life of renunciation. And to this observation, we owe much thanks to the late Joseph Van Es, to Sarah Sviri, Tibadel Chaim Arukim, and also to Ehud Krinis in a forthcoming work. The first mode involved renunciation of whatever could bring any kind of pleasure or even comfort to the body. The other mode changed the focus from bodily renunciation to what is considered to be the root, that is, the very desire that lurks in the soul. The problem was well defined by Al-Kharaz in the following words that continued the last quote. One can live in poverty, own nothing, and still desire the world and seek its benefits. In order to overcome this, renunciation was to center on one's internal life. Instead of seeking to bring one's physical strength to its very limits, one was called to overcome the very desire for pleasure, regardless of whatever this pleasure is, whether this pleasure is achievable or not. The transformation from asceticism that centers on bodily activities to asceticism that focuses on the mental sphere brought about heightened attention to the internal enemy and an intensified concentration on the soul as a negative constituent of one's interiority. A prominent representative of this mode of asceticism and its foremost spokesman was Haret al-Muhasibi, died 855. A native of Basra, active most famously in Baghdad. According to Muhasibi, there are two main elements of evil, both deceptive and treacherous. The first of these is the nafs, the internal element of evil. The second is Iblis, the devil, who is the external element, manipulating the first element by inspiring it to misdeeds. The former, according to Muhasibi, is more dangerous than the latter. The soul, in its innate tendencies, declines to bear the burden of renunciation that may grant one a place in the world to come. Instead, it is devoted to the pleasures that it can experience in this world. In the words of Muhasibi, you must know that the soul, according to its natural inclination and its design, refuses to make the necessary effort to abstain from the pleasures of the world. Arguing that the soul employs subterfuge and various stratagems to ensure that its desires are fulfilled, Muhasibi speaks vehemently against the nafs, guiding his addressee. Do not be deceived by what it, that is the nafs, makes manifest to you. Do not hope for what it wishes. If you resist it, you will have gone astray, and if you fulfilled its request, you will be destroyed. If you became heedless of taking it into account, then you will have fled responsibility. If you were unable to oppose it, you will be drowned, and if you submitted to its desires, you will have been appointed a place in hellfire. The nafs has no truth, and no good can come from it. It is the cause of every tribulation, a treasure trove of disgrace, the vault of Iblis, and the abode of every evil. Every time it manifests fear, then you are secure. Every time it claims to be truthful, it is lying. And every time it mentions sincerity, it is ostentation and self-conceit. How should one oppose the rebellious enemy that lies within? Muslim ascetic discourse has developed a rich language that describes the struggle with the soul, the latter's modes of resistance, and the measures that can be taken in order to overcome it. A central term that infuses this discourse in this regard is the taming or mastering of the soul, or in Arabic, riyadat al-nafs. Notably, riyada was translated in many cases as exercising or disciplining. This translation rightly captures the importance of repetition and of the acquisition of habits in confronting the soul, but it does not capture a specific hue that is central to its use in the discourse on asceticism. That is, a discourse in which what is emphasized is mastering, subjugating, and conquering the soul. The subjugation of the soul was considered to be a necessary condition for any religious excellence, and was succinctly formulated by Abu Uthman al-Hiri. It is attributed to him in a work by Rasulami. No one will reach the level of the elected if he has yet to refine his morals and to tame his soul. Riyadat al-nafs. According to one trend of Muslim asceticism, taming the soul involves practices of the body, practices of abstention, such as fasting and seclusion. Alternatively, ascetics that considered the core of renunciation to lie within render riyada in a rather different manner. It was tied to a scrupulous awareness to the soul and to its ruses, and to a meticulous, unrelenting observation of its most subtle movements, in order to prevent it from arousing the desire for worldly gains and pleasures. Two aspects are central in this regard. One is an acknowledgement of the immense power of the inner enemy that is related to its capacities for manipulation, khiyal al-nafs. The other is the need for unwavering vigilance. Thus, notes Muhasibi, one should be careful not only in view of everything out there, but to take every precaution, especially against your soul, as indeed it is, quote, your true enemy. Thus far, we have examined the negative coloring of the concept of soul as it was fashioned in Muslim ascetic discourse, and the sweeping demand it presented for the subjugation and conquering of the nafs. The sources of these discourses are in the different stages of the development of asceticism in the East, but it has also left its written imprint in works authored by ascetics and in traditions that were attributed to ascetics who embodied this unique form of life. These works and traditions, as shown most prominently by Juan Vizcaíno and also by Manuela Marin and Amos Goldreich, made their way westward and were widely circulating in Muslim Spain. Through the efforts of such figures as Muhammad ibn Wada and others who traveled in the East in order to collect materials on ascetics and asceticism, the idea of the soul as a bitter internal enemy was now to be found in the Iberian Peninsula. However, this body of literature was not the only one who migrated westward. It was joined by another corpus that presented an altogether different notion of the soul, to which I shall now briefly turn. I am talking on a vast body of literature that was strongly impacted by Neoplatonic trends. I will focus here on only one example, that of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity, Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa, a work whose significant presence and impact in Al-Andalus was explored by several of the scholars that take part in our conference. In its core, the Ikhwan's notion of the soul was rooted in a polar distinction, already well familiar from Plato, between the human body and the human soul. The former is considered to be dark, corruptible, and mortal substance, and the latter a luminous, incorruptible, and immortal principles. Here is one quote, but dozens of others could be presented as well. This is from the 15th epistle. Know, O my brother, that the divine objects are forms abstracted from matter, and that they are permanent, eternal substances in which neither corruption nor detriments are inherent as they are inherent in the physical objects. And know that your soul is one of such forms. Make then every effort for the sake of its knowledge, and perhaps you will free it from the sea of matter, the abyss of bodies, and the prison of nature into which we fell. Characteristically, the Ikhwan start their analysis with an arsenal of images and metaphor to depict the soul and its relation to the body. The soul was drowned in the sea, descended to the abyss, and imprisoned in matter. It is the soul's duty to seek to liberate itself from the chains of this sad condition. This liberation is tied to the idea that earthly life is ephemeral. Sooner or later, there will come a time when the body dies, as happens with every corruptible being under the sublunar sphere. But the soul is not perishable, so that in a certain sense, its real life begins exactly when the body terminates. This is what the Ikhwan mean when they assert paradoxically that the death of the organism is the birth of the soul. The Rasail is not the only work of Neoplatonic orientation that circulated in Jewish circles in Al-Andalus. Different Jewish thinkers had access in varying degrees to a vast amount of sources that carried the imprint of the fundamental Neoplatonic scheme of being, among which are the paraphrastic rendition of chapters from the three final Enneads of Plotinus, known as the Theology of Aristo, the works of Isaac Israeli, and the Pseudo-Empedoclean Book of Five Substances. Despite the differences, small and large, between these works, they still largely share a similar notion of the soul, which involves a reversal of what we've seen in the ascetic discourse. Whereas Zud literature emphasized the lower rank of the soul, the Neoplatonic view presented its origin in the higher realms of being. Moreover, the soul is no longer considered to be a burden on one's existence, but a precious deposit. It is not in need of suppression, but of liberation, not a source of self-deceit, but a power of truth attaining, not gravitating towards the world, but aspiring to escape from the world. And at the end of one's earthly life, it is not depicted as standing in trial for its misdeeds, but as returning to its divine source. The Jewish intelligentsia of Al-Andalus has inherited both these discourses and had to navigate in between these two currents that sometimes, as the example of Soul shows, flow in opposing directions. In the minutes I have left, I want to present very briefly two different modes in which this tension was dealt with by Jewish authors. One is Abraham ibn Ezra, and the other Bahya ibn Pakuda. Let's begin, even though we know him to be chronologically later, of course, with Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra's Neoplatonic conception of the soul is in no need of introduction, thanks to the studies of Aaron Hughes, Adina Tenenbaum, and the late, great Israel Levin. To give just one example, we can turn to the following description of the soul in a poem that begins with the words, I can read it in Hebrew first, Atzula mimekor chaim me'ira, gezura mimekom kodesh teora. And in Peter Cole's indeed luminous translation, sent down from a luminous fountain of life, drawn from a sacred place and pure, created as one, though not with form, and greater by far than honor or wisdom. However, this is not a hymn to the soul, as the poem turns into a language of rebuke. ראי על מה שלוחת בתבל, ולמה זה בגוף אפל הצורה. הלעד תרדפי ילדות ושחרות, והבלי האדמה הארורה. מתוקה לך בראשיתה שנתה, והיא קשה ואחרונה ומרה. חמודות הזמן עזבי, ולמה בצאתך תהיי גולה וסורה. Why were you ushered into the world, and then in the dark of the body imprisoned? At first its sleep seems sweet to you, but in the end it's hard and bitter. Put the pleasures of time behind you, unless in exile you'd always wander. Notably, there emerges a reproach of the soul that is formulated using terminology drawn, at least in part, from ascetic discourse into a poem whose general framework is Neoplatonic. This is not a unique case, and not even the most pointed one. If we turn for a moment to another poem by Ibn Ezra, we will find an even more negative approach involving condemnation of the soul in harsher terms. Thus, in a bite from his poem, Im lo ted'i nafshi, the poet addresses his soul in the following terms. היטל זמן בך לעמל נידחת, קונה ובונה ועודך לא נחת. הכל יכלה ועל מה בטחת, הלא בתענוגך שכרך לקחת. Time has mocked you, it has driven you to mischief. You build and buy and are not satisfied. When it all fades, you will ask, have I trusted in vain? Your indulgence was your sole reward. This is in Leon Weinberger's translation. Let us return to our main Ibn Ezra poem, sent down from a luminous fountain of life. As we saw, the poet integrates into the Neoplatonic scheme a tone of rebuke, a voice that comes from Zud literature, and more specifically from a subgenre of ascetic poems, the Zuhadiyat, associated particularly with the eminent poet Abu al-Athiyah, and also known from some Hebrew manifestations of the genre, remarkably studied by Tova Be'eri. Moreover, the soul is presented as in need of rebuke precisely on the basis of the Neoplatonic scheme. Each moment spent without devoting itself to wisdom is a moment in which the soul neglects its divine origin, from which it was exiled and to which it shall eventually return. In such a note, the poem concludes, זכור לחקור כבודך, זה יסודך, וטובך לעבוד אל חי במורה. קחי עצה לעולם זה, למען בעולם בא תהיי עם אל צרורה. Consider your glory, for this is your good, to serve the living God in all. Listen while living within this world, and be bound in the one to come with the Lord. Renunciation is thus contained as part of the odyssey that the soul undergoes, and the negative approach is framed by a positive one. More generally, it can be said that the containment of asceticism was a prevalent move of the Sephardi poets. Their modus operandi came from the realm of Muslim adab culture, using elements of Zud to take a moralizing stance critical of the enticements of the world, as a counterbalance to the secular poetry of love and wine that was so dominant in the courtly culture from the early caliphate onwards. An almost polar approach is to be found in the case of Bahya ibn Pakuda. In general, as already demonstrated by Amos Goldreich, and as will be far more elaborately explored by Ehud Krinis in his work in progress, Bahya adopted in his work, The Duties of the Heart, basic patterns that are drawn from the work and thought of Muhasibi. Specifically, a religious ethos that is based on inner asceticism and its identification as a duty imposed on the heart. However, into this general pattern, and in stark contrast to Muhasibi, Bahya integrates a Neoplatonic conception of the soul. In his formulation, the soul is presented no longer as an enemy, but instead as one's most precious deposit, described in the following terms. The soul, sorry for the rather vague, the soul is, I hope it's still readable, but I will read it in any case. The soul is a simple spiritual substance which inclines by its nature to the spiritual beings that are like itself, and rejects by its nature the coarse bodies which are unlike it. However, because it is tied to a body and to the desires of the instincts, and in order not to fall prey to their whims and become totally absorbed in this world, the soul is in need of mastery and taming, in a process whose terminology we've already encountered, riyadat al-nafs, thus presented. And here is a quote from the very beginning of the book. So we can sense the infiltration of the Zud concept of nafs. Every man's foe is within him, unless God provides him with immunity, and his soul with an ever-present guardian, endowed with the overwhelming power to restrain it with the reins of mastery, zamam al-riyada, bind it with the bridle of justice, and give it a taste of the bitterness of the moralizing whip. When this kind of man intends to do good, he achieves it immediately, for when his soul entices him to something else, he reproves it and overcomes it. In the gap between the description of the soul and the description of what the proper attitude towards the soul is, we can sense the tension that was central to this talk. Throughout his work, Bahya indeed tries to provide a resolution to this tension that has to do with the amplification and the full demonization of the concept of Hawa, the Yetzer or instinct, a complex and interesting affair I cannot go into. At any rate, to our concern, it is not the solution that is important, but the problem, that is, the fact that an Andalusian author finds himself navigating between two different intellectual frameworks, that of ascetic literature and that of Neoplatonically oriented one, that interpret key terms, sometimes the very same key terms, very differently. Bahya's approach to this tension is starkly different from that of Ibn Ezra, in the sense that instead of integrating renunciation into the tonality of the Neoplatonic scheme of being, he presents a Neoplatonic conception of the soul that is made to fit into an ascetic ethos and form of life. Asceticism in Bachya is no longer one melodic line in a symphony full of counterpoints, but it is formally constructed in the form of variations on asceticism that encompasses all elements, including those that originate in Neoplatonic sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omer. Now we have enough time for discussion and questions. We use this. Yeah, for questions.
A.
Thank you very much, Omer. As you said, both approaches, that of the Zud and that of the Ikhwan al-Safa, are present in Hebrew literature. I paid attention in my book on gender in Hebrew poetry. It's called in English Unveiling Eve, and in Hebrew Tzeda Tzviya. I had a whole chapter about the soul as a woman. She is always a woman. When she is tempting, or when she is sinning, or when she had to be reproached or tamed, she is a shrew. That's why she has to be tamed. So I think that this is so, this metaphor or simile is so widespread that I think it has to be taken attention of. Thank you.
I can. Shumim. At this point, I can only thank you. I mean, of course, read this wonderful work of scholarship. The conception of the soul is so prevalent and so rich in its multiple facets. Gender ones, from the perspective of gender, of anthropology, of theology, of metaphysics, of psychology. And indeed, Andal Balfei Menashe, one of a multitude of far better scholars than I am in exploring the intricacies of the soul. But what I think I can contribute to the discussion at this point is how much each author that was inheriting or that had access to this different, it's not only one or two works of literature or philosophy, but trends that were prevalent in Al-Andalus had to navigate between two starkly opposing conception of the soul and find one's own solutions and how to navigate in it. And that all these solutions, as far as kind of I managed to explore, are ones in which you can see that it's not hermetically closed. I mean, there are glitches, and you can see how even one who wanted to go fully fledged Neoplatonically still has this burden of Zud on one's back, and vice versa. So this is in where specifically I located myself.
Thank you. Thank you both. Omer, I wanted to push you a bit more because think about your argument. First of all, because in Greek, psyche works also on a whole range of possibilities. And when moving into medieval Hebrew, I think one of the interesting things is that a dualistic understanding of human being is developed, and the word nefesh is a carryover from a much more embodied notion of let's use anima. I won't say more than that. So I think that certainly in Hebrew, part of it all is seems to me a big transition within the Hebrew language of changes of the semantic range and of the metaphysical function of these words. And I just want to hear whatever you have to say about it. So pick it up.
It's sometimes the question, but it's always a question when one wants to explore such a concept as nefesh or the soul, to which past one should go. There are many pasts that can be explored. There is the Hellenic philosophical past. There is the Hebrew uses of the very terms, nefesh or neshama. And there are different histories here, whether it's a rabbinic literature or early piyut or the Bible. And there is Arabic literature, but which Arabic literature? And what basically this talk was an attempt is to locate what seems to me to be two trends in one central past, that of Muslim intellectual tradition, that flows into Al-Andalus and is accessible to Jewish authors. And when from the vantage, from looking from Al-Andalus to this past, we can see how these works were carried into Al-Andalus without necessarily bringing with them the circles that developed these trends. And I took only one route, this one of looking at the soul from this specific, looking at this specific intellectual heritage. One thing that I think is important is that basically when we look at such a great work of scholarship as Adinan's Tenenbaum, the contemplative soul, that kind of tried to look into how the soul was fashioned in by the Sephardi poets of the 11th and 12th century. We see that at first she gives this kind of an overview of what are the sources that we need to look at when we turn to the Sephardi poets. And we see there, so we see basically the Rasai L'Ikhwan HaSafa, and we see the theology of Aristotle, and we see Tochecha by the Kaleri, and we see Saadia Gaon. But Zud literature is strangely missed there. And I think that without taking Zud into account in this regard, we are missing something pivotal in the fashioning of the poetry of these poets. And even more specifically, I only said a few words on it without taking into account the very specific genre of the Zudiyat, of the Zud poems that were also written by Andalusi Muslim poets, and that show stark similarities between them and similar Hebrew poems. So I hope it gives some answer. And
thank you so much to both of you. My question is for Omer. One On the Zut issue, it's striking that the last chapter of Moshe Ibn Ezra, Sefer Anak, is dedicated to Zuhdiyat. I mean, that's the genre in which he places all of the soul-related poems there. That's one thought. But my question is, because this is a conference, at least for Ibn Gabirol, if not strictly about Ibn Gabirol, I was wondering if you could venture some thoughts on the subject of where you would place him in the schema that you've laid out. Where does he fall on this spectrum? Like, certainly one finds a great deal of ambivalence in his poetry about the fact that the soul has been planted within the body. In some cases, he seems to be quite angry with God about having received that the soul was brought down to the level of the body. On the other hand, especially in Keter Malchut, he seems to thank God for precisely the same act. It allows the body allows the soul to act and thereby gain reward. So I'm wondering if you could share a few thoughts on that.
תודה רבה. That's a great question I've been thinking about for some time. And first, I think that it is very interesting to kind of recall in this context the work of Tova Be'eri on the Zuhdiyat, on the Zud poems of poets who were mostly centered or living at least part of their lives in Egypt. And when Professor Be'eri looked at these poems, she said, and wanting to contrast them to something, Ibn Gabirol came to her mind. I mean, as these poets are speaking harshly about their soul, while we can sense in Ibn Gabirol a far more compassionate tone towards the soul, which I think very much captures something profound in Ibn Gabirol. And it has to do with the kind of the Neoplatonic conception of the soul that Ibn Gabirol is a representative of, most certainly. But I think that with Ibn Gabirol, we can sense both in his what is called the secular poetry and in Shirat HaKodesh. We can still sense this tone of rebuke to the soul, which does not go all the way to kind of depict it in a bite after bite, in a verse after verse, as in these harsh terms. But still, when you ask yourself, kind of looking at it from a Neoplatonic vantage point, where does all this rebuke come from? Why doesn't one even need to rebuke the soul in any terms at all, and not to rebuke the body that tries to tame the soul, etc.? So you can feel that Gabirol, even if more gently, still or more subtly, or more drawing it towards the Neoplatonic pole, was very much also into integrating part of Zud into his overall conception of how to approach the soul.
Thank you, Omer, for your talk. My question is about the Zud conception of the soul. The attributes given to the soul in their conception are attributes in the Greek tradition, either given to the body or to a certain part of the soul, the desiderative part of the soul. And these parts are contrasted with another element, the intellect, usually. But in your description of the Zud conception, I didn't see another element to which the soul is contrasted. And if there is no such element, what is the factor that taints the soul?
There is. תודה רבה. It's a very important question. Both are you actually had two. One with regard to the stratification of the soul. The question is whether there are in the Zud conception this kind of tripartite or any other partite conception of the soul. Basically, no. I mean, there are more than one negative elements, but there is no kind of stratification of the soul in itself to good parts and bad parts, or to parts that are more drawn to earthly life. And it it is not part of this discourse. With regards to the other question, okay, is it the soul against something? Most certainly. And here, most famously, it is against the heart. So we have this feud between the heart and the soul in this discourse. And the heart is either aided by or guided by the intellect in some of the conceptions of the heart in Zud. In others, some of them a little later, the heart can achieve what the intellect cannot. So the intellect basically is one of those battling the nafs, even though the intellect in itself can become a hindrance to in the higher stages of one's initiation, in which it will only be the knowledge of the heart that is a more immediate, more direct experience of the divine. We can certainly find it in such a luminous figure as the later Al-Ghazali, but it comes from earlier stages as well. So basically, this is very much right. And to go back to one of the figures I've talked about, to Bahya ibn Takuda, it's very interesting that when he does this purification of the Zud conception of the soul and turning the soul into a far more Neoplatonic kind of soul, he finds himself in a kind of a saturation of concepts. He has, for instance, there is no longer any significant distinction between what distincts the soul from the heart. And in many cases, he uses them as synonyms. He speaks about the soul and the heart in one breath. And it is also a part of this very problem. I mean, he inherited a concept of the soul as a thing to battle. He turned it into a far more purer being in a Neoplatonic vein. And then he's kind of stuck with the problem that he has both soul and heart doing the same thing in his intellectual system complex. And I think that it very much shows that then he kind of has to work with synonyms that are not regularly treated as synonyms.
Well, it was a wonderful beginning to our day. My question is for Camilla, but I just wanted to say, and this is also regarding Jonathan's question about Ibn Gabirol. I think there's lots and lots of work to be done from a sort of poetic, philosophical point of view. I'll just give two examples. I think we can look, for instance, in Ibn Gabirol's poetry, we can look at how he addresses the soul, not only by the contents of his poems. For instance, I think I told you this a few days ago. Shichachi Elonech, when I read in class with students, I usually ask them, how do you picture the speaker's attitude towards the soul? And there are multiple answers. There are some who thinks he rebukes it, some who thinks he's a sort of father figure. And I think that's built into the intonation that Ibn Gabirol created. So that's a literary term which could be used. And the other literary term, which should be interesting, and that's following the previous question, is that of the speaker. And we could ask what sounds like a silly question, which is, who exactly is speaking when he is rebuking the soul? Whose agency, whose voice are we hearing? Is it the speaker? Is it the I in some sense? Is that the heart, and so on? So there's lots of work to do from those literary points of view. And Camilla, as you were speaking, especially with your challenge at the end of how any of that is reflected in the poetry, what came to mind was Theodor Adorno has this wonderful article about lyric poetry. Which is many times conceived as very private. And he says, well, the lyric poet obviously does turn his back many times on the public, but that in itself is a political act. And there are many ways to turn your back. You have to know how to do it, so I think what we're seeing in a sense with the Hebrew poets is all different forms of turning their back on most of the historical context that you described. That doesn't mean we don't have work to do. It just means it's a bit more complicated. So I'm wondering, especially if you have any thoughts about how, for instance, with Ibn Hazm, do you see a clear sense of reflecting the historical context? Do you sense some difference between the Hebrew poets and what you're familiar with from Arabic poetry?
Thank you very much for the question and also for the reference, which I shall definitely check out. So you think that he and others are basically turning their backs also on the whole Muslim context, or just on, say, their Jewish environment?
I'm not sure,
Mhm.
I'm not sure. But the mere fact that practically none of the whole political makeup and the different battles and the crazy assassinations and even just the fact of that arduous travel 600 kilometers north, none of that is apparent in the poems.
Precisely, that's what I was wondering about. Yeah.
So as far as I know, none of it is apparent in the poem. And by the way, even when other poets do address journeys, it's always not just because of the journey. Moshe ben Ezra describes himself as being very far away because he misses his children. And so there has to be an excuse, so to speak, to address some concrete fact of life.
Well, in the case of Ibn Hazm, it's actually different because he was less a poet and more a legal scholar, a theologian, a historian, and his only surviving early-ish work, Tawq al-Hamama, which has also been translated into Hebrew as Anakayona, is actually quite autobiographical, and it does reflect many of the tensions that were going on in Cordoba itself, in Al-Andalus in general. So he does address that, and he talks about the suffering of his family during the fitna. So that's a bit different. He has written poetry in which he it talks about love, of course, but also talks about legal theory, but also topics like having been imprisoned. He was imprisoned at least once, perhaps twice, because of his pro-Umayyad activities. He became also embroiled in all kinds of political intrigues, and he talks about that also in his poetry. So there, he very much addresses that upfront. So it's a different type of literature, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions. We have one question online. Ross? You have to unmute. Yes.
Thank you. Since I can't see everyone who's participating, I don't know who just made the comment about the speaker. I want to draw our attention to, who is that there?
It was Ariel.
Oh, Ariel, okay. I don't recognize voices also. I think there was a very wise comment that Ariel made, because think about the poem Mativ Chadi Nafshi, and I think this relates directly to what Omer was talking about. We see a kind of a mild tension of whoever the speaker is there, struggling with rebuking his soul. It's mild, and I think that's probably the modality that we find in Ibn Gabirol's poetry, not the harsh struggle again between the soul and something else, but this kind of mild rebuke. So I'd invite everyone to take another look at that poem, which is, after all, not a liturgical poem. It's a personal poem.
Thank you. So thank you very much again. And for those of you who are not practicing strict zuhud, asceticism, we have some refreshments outside, and we'll meet again at 11:30, I believe. Thank you very much.